Good afternoon and welcome to day 2 of the ONC's annual technology forum. My name is Ryan Argentieri. I'm the Deputy Director of the Office of Technology at ONC. And I'm so thrilled to be able to welcome you to our conversation, A Look Toward the Future of Clinical Resources. We have with us this afternoon 3 trusted collaborators, industry leaders, and experts in the field of informatics and health policy, electronic exchange of information. I'll start with Mark Savage, Director of Health Policy for UC San Francisco Center for Digital Health Innovation. We have Gay Dolan, Principal and Founder of Namaste Informatics. Gay is an internationally recognized healthcare informaticist who specializes in standards development work. And finally, from outside ONC, Dr. Rob McClure, who is president of MD Partners, a firm that specializes in healthcare terminology and clinical modeling. And previously, Dr. McClure was a trained internal medicine and pediatrician. And also joining us today is Dr. Al Taylor, who is our chief medical, or we call him our chief medical informaticist for ONC. So so happy to have everyone here today. And I'll just mention that our speakers and panelists today are, we're talking about work that we do together through USCDI, and they will share their perspectives and insights both as our collaborators and in their individual professional capacities. So with that, I will, without further ado, kick off the slides and turn it over to Mark Savage.
Great, thanks so much. And thank you very much to the Office of the National Coordinator for inviting me to be with you here today. I'm going to cover both some of the data elements that are missing from the US Core Data for Interoperability and some work that the Gravity project on which I sit is doing to try to meet that need. So when ONC first released the draft US Core Data for Interoperability back in 2018, this is what we at UC San Francisco Center for Digital Health Innovation were looking at. A little bit of tweaks here to update for some developments, but this is basically it. ONC had already identified the common clinical data set and had required that all, in the 2015 edition, had required that all certified EHRs be able to exchange this common clinical data set. The draft Core Data for Interoperability back in 2018 was a proposal on how to prioritize and add new data elements to this common clinical data set. And the point of this slide is not really to show all these individual data elements, but really to highlight what's missing and how long it could take in order to add things that we, at least at UCSF, who are charged with critical healthcare needs, might need to add now. So just a couple of examples from the lower right box there, not scheduled. The patient's personal representative was not on the draft schedule, and the reconciled medication list was not on the draft schedule. So just, this is the kind of thing that we were considering as we looked at the proposal. As we considered what recommendations to make to ONC in our comment letter, we considered some of the strategic priorities. So for delivery of care, basic, the data elements that help advance referrals, especially from primary care physician to specialty care, continuity of care and care coordination. These kinds of data elements have great importance to those involved in care. For patients and family caregivers, the data elements that help care planning and coordination are especially important. And key demographic data sets that help meet and understand the individual where she is are critical as well. And then for providers, patients, and family caregivers all together as partners in care, the data elements that help care planning and coordination, and bidirectional access so that providers too have access to critical information about patient-reported outcomes, patient-generated health data, and social determinants of health. So those are, from a CDHI perspective, these are strategic priorities for adding missing data elements to the US Core Data for Interoperability. And we in our work, tend to recognize that there are a variety of stakeholders across the ecosystem, And we would recognize that ONC and others would want to consider the strategic priorities of others, such as payers, public health, researchers, other core stakeholders. Similarly, as we were considering what recommendations to make about missing data elements, we thought about how these data elements fit into different use cases. We are mindful that often one data element serves multiple use cases, potentially multiplying its importance. So to think of it not in just as it meets, say, clinical care, but how does it meet the variety of use cases that are top of mind in the nation today? So obviously interoperability and the interoperability roadmap and patient access, but value-based care delivery, especially with COVID-19, an emphasis on social determinants of health and remote care and patient-generated health data. CMS's new cutting-edge work on digital health, digital quality measures, the Precision Medicine Initiative, and indeed an entire robust app ecosystem, which needs to have structured data which you can access through FHIR APIs in order to meet use cases. So these are sort of the use cases that we had in mind. So when UCSF's Center for Digital Health Innovation submitted comments on the proposed rule, we discussed these things at length. And we had in mind what ONC had said in its proposed rule. Technical specifications were already available for 46 of the 50 data elements listed for candidate status and emerging status, so there was definitely room to maneuver, and that they are all critical to achieving nationwide interoperability. The proposed rule also acknowledged that the common clinical data set had unfortunately become a sort of symbolic and practical limit to the industry's collective interest to go beyond the common clinical data set for access, exchange, and use. In other words, it tended to function as a ceiling, not a floor. Whereas I think ONC intended it to be a floor, not a ceiling, but that was the way it was operating out in the world. And from our perspective, we wanted it to be a floor, and all of these data elements could not come fast enough to meet our needs and to meet the needs of the national health imperatives. So we actually suggested a different mindset, with flipping the question and asking, are there objective reasons to delay adding all of these data elements since they are generally so important? So what you see in the middle is what we proposed to ONC to be added now. Cognitive status, functional status, gender identity, all critical data elements about the individual, all needed now in order to provide better care. Pregnancy status, definitely added now, given its implications for care on multiple levels. Diagnostic image reports and pathology reports, they're relatively simple to do technologically as we understand it, I should say as I understand it, and definitely help with specialty referrals. Pathology reports are critically important in care coordination, particularly when receiving a specialty referral. Specialists need the access to the person's lab results, the imaging results, the pathology results at a minimum. For care coordination and shared care planning, the individual goals, provider goals, and care team members absolutely necessary in order to be able to do that care coordination together. The personal representative, this is the person who steps in for the patient as needed, mentioned throughout the various regulations, definitely need to be added now as a component for the patients and the authorized representative's ability to view, download, transmit, and access their health data. Advanced directive to know whether the person has a do not resuscitate or not definitely needs to be added now, a critical element of patient decision-making. A reconciled medication list. Medication errors represent the most common patient safety error. More than 40% of medication errors result from inadequate reconciliation and handoffs during admission, transfer, and discharge of patients. Critical thing to be adding now. The reason for the referral, health insurance information to help with knowing how to cover costs and affordability up front. Social determinants of health. 85 to 90% of one's health status is explained by determinants outside the clinical setting. Extremely important to add now. So those were the elements that we recommended giving priority now in order to improve health and care for individuals and to improve those use cases that I highlighted earlier for the ecosystem. So I want to turn now to the Gravity project. It's working feverishly to build data elements, coded value sets, and fire IGs for missing social determinant of health data elements. I'm the Gravity project's social determinant policy director, and I sit on the project management team. I'm not going to be covering anything close to all of the work that the Gravity project is doing. Instead, I just want to illustrate how one national project is working to add missing data elements quickly, just as an illustration. As I said earlier, we know there's a tidal wave of interest in social determinants because they account for so much of one's health status. And those are the factors in people's daily lives, 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, outside the 15-minute office visit. And they need to be brought into the information flow for the clinical setting. So consequently, there's a huge interest in figuring out how to measure and address socioeconomic factors as part of healthcare. And we've seen how critical that is so recently with the social risks in COVID-19 as an illustration. So we started with identifying the priority domains, and this is work that UC San Francisco's SIREN, Social Interventions Research and Environment Evaluation Network, launched in 2019. We're a national collaborative to develop structured data standards to reduce barriers for documenting and exchanging social risk. And we convene stakeholders across the country. At latest count, it was more than 1,100 people working in various configurations, including public phone calls, in an open and transparent collaborative process where we developed together the test standards to facilitate capture and exchange. We began by looking at the 6 commonly used social screening tools, and this work began back in 2018. So the 6 that you see there on the left of the slide: CMMI's Accountable Health Communities Demonstration Program, the National Association of Medicine's Recommended Social and Behavioral Domains and Measures, PREPARE from NACHC, Health Leads, Seek, We Care. So we went through these screening tools and we identified the kinds of factors and extracted them in a systematic search. We also were looking at the 4 common medical vocabularies: LOINC, SNOMED CT, ICD-10, and CPT, or Common Procedural Technology. We were looking for codes related to screening for social risk factors, assessing the social needs, goals, and intervening to address those needs. And what you see on the right is the result of that very elaborate review for the 20 social determinant of health domains. And the Gravity project decided to jump in and begin with 3 of them. We began with food insecurity, housing instability and insecurity, and transportation access. A little bit to illustrate the nationwide collaboration of stakeholders and experts. We're not just a research effort. We bring together providers, patients, community and social service organizations, EHR and app vendors, public health agencies, government policymakers such as ONC. We have a series of different teams. So there are domain teams and technical teams that are working on the technical side. We have clinical informaticists working on the standards and terminology side, project management, governance committees, foundations and sponsors that are so generously helping to fund this work and make it go forward. So this is a quick list of the interconnected activities and collaborations we undertake, often in parallel, to get this going. We begin with the domain, and I'll use food insecurity as an example, working with all of these different collaborators. The team reviews the data elements within that domain across the 4 clinical activities: screening, diagnosis, goals, interventions. If the public collaborative identifies data elements or code values that are missing, we stop, we discuss them. People submit new ideas for data elements that need to be added. They submit ideas for gaps. We review that, we adjudicate that, and then we take that adjudicated result, which is approved by a consensus vote of the collaborative, and we submit it to the coding stewards. We are also proud to be one of HL7's core FHIR accelerator projects. So to enable the data exchange and interoperability of this social determinant data, we are also developing a FHIR implementation guide for each domain, which is standardized guidance on how the data should be exchanged. Testing and validation takes place through FHIR's Connectathons to verify that the specification is complete and to facilitate maturity. And then we submit it for balloting through HL7 FHIR IG balloting process. And lastly, we develop a reference implementation to support real-world pilots and implementations. Quick illustration of the interconnectedness of this work, both the terminology side and the technical side. On the terminology side, as we do that work, that sort of seeds the initial codes that are used on the technical side to begin with the FHIR IG development. And conversely, the FHIR AG development in turn informs what goes into, for example, the VSAC and the Interoperability Standards Advisory. So with these, we then have the ability to push data elements, coded value sets, standardized FHIR SDOH implementation guides out to the world for providers and community clinics, for payers, EHR vendors, regulators, and key among them, ONC's U.S. core data for interoperability, where social determinants of health is a proposed data class and all of the data elements underneath it. So that is a very fast, very quick overview of how one project is trying to work quickly to get data elements that are missing from US CDI into US CDI for better health and better care. So a few closing observations. First, I just want to applaud ONC for holding this session to examine what's missing as well as what's there. That's the way we move the ecosystem forward, and all of us on this panel so appreciate that. The technical, as I said before, technical specifications are already available for many of these data elements that were listed as candidates. They agreed that they're critical. From our perspective at UCSF's Center for Digital Health Innovation, they can't come fast enough, and COVID-19 illustrates that, value-based care delivery illustrates that, the need for a robust app API ecosystem to help with the launch of FHIR-based APIs in 2022 illustrate that. And lastly, the Gravity Project's work illustrates one way, grounded in multi-stakeholder collaboration to help make it so. Thanks so very much. And I think I pass it back to you, Ryan.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And I'm glad you plugged Gravity there because I missed that in the introduction. Before I introduce Gay Dolan and Rob McClure, I just also wanted to make sure everyone knew to expand their slides. If you can't see the slides, I just realized that some people might be having issues where there's a lot of content on some of the slides. And also check your briefcase. We have some fact sheets and helpful resources in the briefcase that pertain to US CDI for those who may be joining us without existing knowledge of that subject matter. So with that, without further ado, I will now turn it over to Gay Dolan to kick us off for the next part of the session. Gay?
Great, thanks, Ryan. Yeah, so thank you, Mark, for your analysis and for I think I need this. There we go. Thanks, guys. Yeah, thanks for your analysis. I'm glad to see that the analysis that you have gone through is very similar to the things that Rob and I have been looking at and helping to advise and provide input to the ONC decision-making process with respect to the US CDI data elements. So Rob and I have both spent many years in the standards development space and are quite involved, have our fingers in just about everything that's going on with respect to the clinical aspects of standards development. And so we were asked to provide some input to this process based on a list of things we know folks have been asking for, as well as lists of elements that were out there that could be considered resources for what are the upcoming data elements. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about what the process that we went through, the things that we examined, and what our heuristics were, which have, if you went to the last session, and what are the heuristics that, some of the heuristics that Mark was talking about as well, are very similar. And so we want to, part of this is to give you input too on how you might be going through the process of moving data elements farther along in the maturity paradigm, and maybe making them jump faster through the hoops of the on-deck, of the new on-deck process. And if knowing, you know, what we have gone through, and where you can go and look for the various maturity levels. So we had, as I mentioned, we started with a list either from input from what we know people have asked for in our daily business lives, and or other lists that were pointed out to us to go through, and we then took these data elements and we analyzed them, and then slotted them into various categories, and such as, you know, we think you should include this. Maybe you should include it. It's implementation ready. Maybe, but it needs work, and consider for future use. So. And this is in addition to that, our input process was to look at what's going on in the standards world. Has the data element been through a connectathon? We had discussions with implementers and other domain expertise. Just actually popping back to this previous slide a little bit, we know that there are some very important things that should be included with respect to payers, payer data elements, payment. That's what it often comes down to. And knowing that one of the accelerator projects, which you probably all know about, called the Da Vinci process, the Da Vinci program, is working very, very, very intensely on these needed data elements. And so we left that those opinions and advice to be to the Da Vinci folks to provide to ONC. So when you think about if you were at the last session, and Al was talking about the process of how a data element proceeds through, and how anyone should be able to just go say, this data element is really important to me, and, you know, please include it. And, you know, conversely, there might be folks that they know they are working on data elements. They know it in terms of the standards world, how to represent them, and what standards and vocabularies can be used to represent those. And you can, I think the more information that you're able to provide ONC about why the data element is important, where it is or is not standardized, and will be helpful for you for moving the data element along in the process. And one of the ways that you can do that is to get involved in the accelerator programs, which the Gravity Project is one of the accelerator programs, but they're all similar in that they provide a sort of a fast track way, an organized way. There's project management, and there's advice on how to navigate the HL7 process, which, you know, for a newbie, it can be a little bit, and let's just say you really need someone who knows how to help you navigate through the process. Because if you know what's out there and what's not out there, you can jump in and help develop how to represent your particular data elements you're interested in. You can figure out the best place to jump in. And one of the ways that even I will still look at to determine if a data element is out there and if it's modeled, is to Google it. Google FHIR plus whatever your data element is, and you'll be surprised that you'll often find work that's either very mature or not mature and needs your input to move it along in the process, and then once again suggest it to be included. And then there's this other area. There's something within FHIR called a FHIR compartment, and this is an interesting list of data elements that will that provides a pretty good way of looking at what's out there. So I originally was not actually that familiar with what the compartments were, and it really is, because you don't think of it in terms of a it's not a clinical thing that you might think of, because really it is a compartment is really defines how resources are accessed on a server. And each resource may belong to one or more compartments. And it really is a logical grouping of resources. And so if you look at, in particular, one of the compartments is called patient. The patient compartment includes any resources where the subject of the resource is the patient. And so it will give you insight into what is out there in FHIR related to patient and related to common data elements associated with the patient. So it's really one way to view the granular data elements needed in the communication of patient data that are or are not defined in FHIR. And so it's just another viewpoint to help you focus in on what's out there and what needs more maturity, and you can find out if your data element is included in there. It includes things like audit elements and some more technical things. So, you may not think at first strike that it's something that it would be valuable, but it's a good way to focus in on what's out there. So lastly, one of the things before I wanted to pass it on to Rob, because I'm talking in general, in a general perspective of the work that we did, and he's going to grab a couple of particular data elements and walk through the process and talk in more detail about what that process is like. So then one thing before I hand it off there is, what do you as implementers, developers, clinicians need when you go to, say, the US CDI pages where it says this is a US CDI element? What do you need there? Well, is it adequate enough to simply assert a code system or a subset of that code system, for example, what's called a value set? Or do you need some additional information? If you would go to ask folks to implement, there's quite a bit of steps that you need to go through to determine what do you exactly mean by a clinical note or a health concern or social determinants of health or even problem. And how do you know, is it really adequate to say, use all of SNOMED? And so it could be that, at least our opinion is that it would be much more beneficial to provide more information so that folks can go ahead and find out the information they need to advise their developers and their implementation. And so in alliance with the current mantra of this latest rule, we would recommend pointing to a specific version once the data element gets to the point where it's in the US CDI, and asserted that if it's in the US CDI, it should also point to a specific version of the standard, because vocabulary alone is not sufficient. You need to have a vehicle with which to carry that that vocabulary along. So what we would recommend is to point to a specific version of the standard, but allow newer ones as they come along in alliance with the standards advancement process. So with that, I would hand it over to Rob to talk about the process with respect to in the context of different data elements.
Hi, folks. Thanks again for everyone coming and spending some time with us today. Hope you're all without shoes on like me today. As Gay noted, we went through and looked at a whole host of let's say, potential data elements, data classes using USCDI speak, with the assumption that we needed to add more to the original, the version 1, because, as she noted, and actually as Mark spent a good amount of time talking about, there's a lot of information that isn't listed in the USCDI that is important in clinical care. And in fact, those of us now, perhaps our perspectives at time a little biased in what we believe can be encoded and captured in a regularized way. But I think there is a lot of information that's encoded and captured in a regularized way that we could encourage interoperability around if we, explained the process that the community of clinicians is going through to ONC, and as Gay also noted, gave guidance with regards to the fact that there's some standardized ways that information can be exchanged that either a good portion of the community has adopted, or if the community has not fully adopted, perhaps there's enough clarity that we could encourage the community to adopt. And in fact, what you'll see is that this list, I think the list that I've picked from, which we had, as you got a sense of on that one slide, we had a number of data elements that some of which resulted in proposed new data classes that we thought would be important for ONC to consider. I think the list that Mark talked about pretty much aligns in many respects with some of the things that we've actually provided. And the number one that I'm going to talk about as an example of that is medication request. And again, as a guidance perhaps to the community that's watching this presentation as to what they might put into the on-deck process, even though the USCDI is currently identifying data classes and then data elements, and then associating those with generalized vocabulary guidance, we think that it will be very important, even in the promotion process, and hopefully at some point in the inclusion in what USCDI has, to have the standards that would enhance the exchange, the transport of that information. So that's what we did. We looked at a number of these. This example, medication is the data class, and then medication request would be the data element. And we feel like that's ready for inclusion. It could go right on through past comment and all the way on up into the next version because it's so important and because it's actually implemented in a pretty consistent fashion across some of the primary standards that are in use in the United States, those being FHIR and CCDA, we know V2, and obviously there are other medication-related standards that are important, but this is about exchange of information, between EHR and other associated organizations. So this slide goes over, I won't go in detail on all the items here, you can read this, but it essentially is the sort of information that we felt was important for ONC to understand that by putting this into the USCDI, at a very specific level, instead of just saying medications, that it would be more clarity with regards to how organizations could successfully interoperate. And actually, so one of the other things I wanted to mention on this, and I'll gold star for the person who finds the misspelling. That's what you get for having to submit your slides a week in advance. But and it's not on the slide. This particular example is something that, as we know, it's medication already as a data class. So this would be a new data element that we would be promoting. So the next example is not already on there. So advanced directive is what we would be proposing as a new data class. We think it's important, again, for this example, it's important enough that the advanced directive should be a data class in and of itself, because there's other pieces that are really data element level things that would fall inside that data class. And not all of them are necessarily ready in terms of the standards that support them, or the kind of adoption that we would propose is, kind of necessary in order to get all the way into the next release. But this one we think was, and that is the advanced directive, the personal advanced care plan. That's an IG that was put together, that's associated with CZDA and implemented within that family of HL7 standards. There isn't actually a FHIR IG that aligns with that yet, but it's something that's being considered and worked on. And because what we're talking about doing with this particular one is really a document sort of idea, it would fit well with our existing standards. A lot of people have implemented CCDA. And so it's a sort of thing to communicate to ONC that this is really ready. People need it. It's obviously useful. Again, Mark mentioned it. And there's the kind of information available on it so that people could readily pick it up, and even if they aren't doing something like this already. The next example, for those of you that know me, this is a pet project of mine. Many people are engaged in this, and this was also something that Mark, I think, mentioned, and that's gender identity. It's actually a critical part to accurately interact with a community that is not well represented, and in fact is important in the context of clinical care. So this is something that's actually discussed on FHIR specifically with regards to how they might address it. ONC, while it does not include this particular data element, hence it's a promotion, in the current version of the USCDI, they do mention the importance of collecting gender identity within the material that's associated with cures. And so hopefully, again, there's a lot of organizations that are already capturing this information. But again, we don't see it as a ceiling. We see it as a floor. It belongs in USCDI, because through that process, people who do tend to see USCDI as a ceiling will at least move that ceiling up in their organizations and be able to capture this. Now, the reason that this is listed as both implementation ready and needs work is that there are a couple of projects. One is this HL7 project that's called Gender Harmony, that's working through some of the details about what information, how to best structure the capture of what we call sex contacts, sex identity contacts. And gender identity is one of them. It's not the only thing that we have to capture in terms of taking good care of patients. And we're not completed with that work. We expect it to be done by the end of the year. And interestingly, there's a parallel activity that we've kind of come closely kind of not merged, but aligned with, that's happening in Canada, that's a little bit broader in scope. It includes sexual orientation, also includes pronouns. And what's nice is the fact that those two activities, plus there's some others that we're hearing about, I think are aligning along this in this space, so that there is going to be, hopefully with good general input from the whole affected community, we'll be able to give some recommendations that organizations can follow. That kind of thing, I think, is the sort of thing that ONC needs to be made aware of. And while they may not say, okay, we need to put gender identity right away into the next version of USCDI, What they can do is follow and perhaps promote organizations to begin to engage in doing the things that are already standardized, so that we can learn more about how effective they are. That's the idea of these lower level stages in the on-deck process. So again, I think this is an example of what we would say is a new proposed data element in an existing data class of patient demographic. Now, this last slide is an example of a whole slew. Again, Mark spoke to these. And again, I hope all of the folks who are watching the presentation, certainly all the clinicians, know how important the social determinants of health are with regards to the provision of care. And the healthcare community has not done a great job of collecting this information to date. And but there's been a lot of activity around looking at how we should do that. And one of the things that's become clear is that many of these social determinants of health are best assessed through what we would call a questionnaire. And in fact, there are, for a number of these, there are standardized approaches to doing that have been vetted and tested, that even end up providing summary scores that I think for many institutions, they've even implemented them. For a number of those, not all of them, but for a number of those, they've even gone to LOINC, which is a standardized terminology that has a way of representing survey instruments. And that process allows for the exchange of information, so not just the summary score, but the exchange of all the questions. Because in fact, the information, oftentimes as a clinician, you want to see what each individual, the response to each individual question was. And because they have different impacts with regards to the chosen therapies or the interaction that you want to have with the patient with regards to that particular issue. And so having some standardization around the data that's collected is very useful if you're talking about interoperability. It's particularly important when you're talking about over a course of time. You want to see that certain things change, which might be changes in the set of answers that are going to occur across the set of questions that are associated with that particular determinant of health. So we need a way to be able to do that in a consistent, interoperable way. And what we found was that if we promote each individual one of these to ONC, yes, that's important. And the fact that there's LOINC codes that might be associated with them is important. I worry when I look at the ISA for some of these, and I see a pick a winner approach that perhaps is kind of an outcome of the way that process is put together. So one survey instrument for cognitive status gets picked. It might not even be one that is oftentimes used. And so with that in mind, when we looked at this, we felt like because there's so much consistency across these social determinants, because knowing that, okay, obviously the list that I have here, I think is all important, but I don't know that we would have put travel status near the top of the list a year ago. We obviously might be more interested in that now. And so that means that as these things change, ONC, oh, well, this year we need to put travel status as a specific data element, and then identify a particular survey instrument that might capture the right pieces of information. That seems like a lot of overhead to us. And so one of the things that we thought would be valuable is for ONC to also consider consistent approaches to common things. And in that context, with regards to these things, the idea of using questionnaire response immediately came to mind. Now, that puts a different spin on things, because one possible approach to this would be to say, look, let's make sure we follow questionnaire response, which, by the way, is very well defined in FHIR. There's some very specific, current approaches to questionnaire response in something called the Structured Data Capture implementation guide, where you can capture important elements, the responses out as what I'll call first-class observations. So it's a working system. The NLM through the LHS or LHC has a working prototype. I shouldn't even call it a prototype. It's a working service that can take defined questionnaire responses and then serve them up through an API so that you can actually generate FHIR resources right through that process that automatically links to LOINC so that you can bring and access existing LOINC defined structures. So there's something that's really implementable right now for any organization to be able to integrate in a consistent manner questionnaire responses and be able to exchange them with very little effort. And the advantage here is that if we focus on getting everybody to accept something like questionnaire response, structured data capture, and again, I want to note that there are some similarities with the process in CCDA, then we wouldn't have to always say, well, what's the next important social determinant of health item that we have to put on our list that becomes somebody's ceiling and hopefully everybody else's floor. Instead, we just say, hey, if you've got something that is exchangeable via a structured data capture questionnaire response, exchange it that way. That's the requirement. So I spent a bunch of time on this because I feel kind of passionate about the fact that I think consistency using established working systems that cover a lot of ground without having to go through each individual item might be a good approach for us to try and push to see if we can adopt. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Ryan, I think. Or no, I guess I go to Al.
Yeah, we'll kick it over to Al. Thank you, Rob. That was great. I really appreciate that perspective and those final remarks. I think that's really helpful, and also touches on some of the questions that are coming in. So with that, Al Taylor, if you could refresh everyone. I know some of you might have been on the previous session, but Al, over to you on USCDI, and if you want to answer any of the questions that have come through in your remarks before I start our official discussion, that would be great.
Sure. Thanks, Ryan. I think the first thing I wanted to do is to thank Mark and Gay and Rob for their work on identifying some of these areas and concepts that are good, solid candidates for addition to USCDI, and the process that they undertook to flesh out the details of those candidates. That's the kind of information specific kind of information that we're looking for in the USCDI maturation or the USCDI version update process. Each of the approaches were a little bit different between Robin Gay's work and Mark's work with Gravity, but the idea is that the significant amount of additional information, fleshing out the use cases, fleshing out the maturity evaluations, those are the kinds of things that we need in order to make a good, solid decision on what ought to be added. It also, having those use cases built out and having the maturity analysis already done is going to help the public, who is going to be the ones that are going to be commenting on a new version of the USCDI, a draft version of the USCDI. And so I just applaud everybody's work on getting that done. And it serves as a great model. I think a lot of the work is the work that was done based on those candidate elements that we published actually a little bit more than 2 years ago. That's sort of so that a lot of the work, if any particular stakeholder has an interest in proposing these some of these data elements, a lot of the work is already done through this, and we expect to have that information available publicly. No promises on timeline, but we do a lot of that analysis we're going to make public because I think it's a very valuable contribution to for the future of USCDI. I'll make sure I got the right slide up. Okay, so there was a question that we had about a question from Shelley Spiro from Pharmacy Health IT about addressing future data elements related to pandemics. And I think that two things that I wanted to say about it. One is, I think to a large extent, depending on how you evaluate the data elements that are required to represent pandemic, as opposed to any other clinical concept. So we have disease states. Obviously, pandemic is a disease state, but it has a population element to it. But so we need to break down a very large concept like pandemic, health IT for pandemics, and say, what exactly are you trying to do? What are you trying to answer and solve with maturing the standards around pandemic? And I think that this is the idea about making sure that health IT is capable of addressing all of the issues that are needed to use health IT to address the pandemic is to just ask the question, like, what are the data elements? This is kind of a landscape analysis. What are the data elements required for pandemic? Is it just lab tests? A lot of work has been done. I mean, over the last couple months, a ton of work has been done to add codes and concepts for lab tests that didn't exist 6 months ago. Simply didn't exist. The codes didn't exist. The tests didn't exist. The FDA approval didn't exist. And a lot of work has been done to make sure all of those things happen. And now we have a rich library of codes that very, very well represent lab tests, lab results, lab specimen types, and those are now published and part of the common vocabulary now. And so that's one aspect of pandemic response that needs to be addressed. But are there other things that are not addressed? Are there elements of a case reporting, electronic case report, that just isn't represented currently in health IT? I don't know the answer to that, but that's one of the things that needs to be addressed. What needs to be, what currently can't be handled in health IT right now. And so that's one of the things that can be done as far as USCDI in the future is, if the use case is if the new use case is we need data elements and data classes to address pandemic response that's not already covered in things like problems, health concerns, laboratory procedures, then that's the work that needs to be done to bring those new data elements and data classes into the discussion for future versions of USCDI. One of the things that I just very briefly, I think that if people have not, did not attend the USCDI presentation today, and a lot of people did, I would encourage you to take a look at the full presentation. But the USCDI is just meant to be there to address those capabilities, to the capabilities and the standards and the data elements for any particular new use cases in the future. And they could be new data elements within an existing data class, expanding, like we expanded pediatric vital signs, expanded to add pediatric vital signs as a requirement, or it could be a new data class. We think that a lot of people have suggested that things like financial information and things related to insurance and coverage and insurance type, that's a valuable piece of data, patient data, that needs to be available and shared. And that's one future potential data class that could be added. But this is meant to address that. And the system that we've put in place allows anybody, at least anybody with an account on the Interoperability Standards Advisory, to go in and submit an idea. It could be an immature idea. It could be a fully fleshed out idea. And we want what we want to see. What we're asking for is give us as much information as you can about the use case, which is to a large extent going to be the justification for making every system out there use, capture and use and exchange that new data element. So that's what we mean by use case is not only how you want to use it as a submitter, but how the rest of the world should use it, or at least the rest of this country should use it, or should want to use it. We do talk about the technical maturity, which is a fairly easy problem to solve relative to identifying the use case as to why everybody should be using it. And we do. So we want to know about how mature the standards are. We want to know how to what extent they're already being exchanged and used in systems and between systems. And then what we do is we put it out to the public. The submission is complete. The public can come in and weigh in just like they weighed in on a lot of aspects of USCDI version 1. And we want to get additional input. There may be another pilot site that someone doesn't know about that could add to the contribute to the knowledge about how the extent to which this information is being exchanged, the breadth of the number of use cases that affect more providers than just a few. And so we want the public input into this is going to be key for us to make a good determination about what should be added to the USCDI. As a reminder for those interested in submitting, and I know that the presenters are painfully aware of the timelines involved right now for this year's submissions. We are the submission system, the OnDeck submission system is open continuously, but we will take submissions as of the 9th of October, which is the second Friday in October. In the future, it'll be somewhere around the 1st of the month. But based on input that has been submitted in the first up until October, those things that are mature enough to be determined to be a level 2, those will be considered for addition to the draft USCDI version 2. And that will be presented to our advisory committee, the HITAC, as well as to the public on around the 1st of January of next year. And for when we do publish our draft USCDI, if you go back, what I have on screen now is a slide of the USCDI landing page. The first tab is the current version 1 of USCDI. The second tab is what will be populated with the complete draft version 2. And so around the 1st of January, you'll be able to see what we have drafted. Before January, you'll be able to see what we've already received and have assigned as level 2, which is the most mature, level 1, and then this thing called comment level as well. So you can go in there now and review comments. There's only one data element that's been submitted so far. But as over the next couple months, that's going to change. I think it's going to change dramatically. And so you can actually subscribe to these sites, the site for changes, and get notification of that. And then you can subscribe to individual data elements and track the changes there as well. I'm going to turn it back over to Ryan to maybe some questions or to do any wrap up that we need to do. I think we still got 15 minutes, right?
Yeah, we got time. I have some questions. And we've got some great questions that have come in. So a few things. I will just note that if we get to your question for some reason, that we do, our contact information is available, will be available. We also have a health IT feedback system that is on the ONC healthit.gov website. So we welcome any additional questions or follow-up. We've been a little behind in responses since March, but we will get back to you. So, if you want to continue the conversation, we welcome you to reach out to us. With that, I'm going to try and summarize a few questions that came through, talking about practical implementation for providers. And I think, Gay, both you and Rob bring that bit of clinician perspective. So one of the ways this question came in early on in the conversation was when confronted with what I'll kind of paraphrase as being quote unquote flawed data or extraneous information and just sometimes maybe more than a provider might need. How do you anticipate that USCDI might help overcome that type of challenge? And, said differently, I think while, Gay, you really explained the patient compartment wonderfully to those who maybe haven't gone in and looked at how what the data sets look like on, under the hood. But in the practical implementation, there does still remain some concerns about provider clinician burden. So maybe I'll see who wants to kind of take that first, Gay or Rob, and then Mark, I have a question for you as well after we've covered that one.
Sure, I think I'll start, and then I'm sure Rob will add. So from my perspective, we can define all we want in standards, but it's as well or as poorly as the standards might be defined. I think it's the implementation of them that makes the difference. And if on the implementation side, so on the EHR side, if the minimal bar is a goal, and just to meet the rulings and the requirements, if things are not done in a creative way to leverage what's already in the EHR, you're going to continue to get those burdens. And every rule that is made and every standard that we create is only going to add burden unless it's cleverly implemented on the implementation side. That's my opinion, and then I'll hand it over to Rob.
Thanks. Well, so burdens are multifactorial, and so part of what's going on is that there's a lot of actors in the process, and there's we have to allow for the resulting solutions to kind of play out, right? So, for example, the work that we do in defining standards, I think is pretty clear to everyone in that it is ahead of the curve with regards to what clinicians could experience. Similarly, could experience because those standards actually have to result in application changes that are designed and then implemented and tested and then implemented in a sense that they have to then be brought into the healthcare organization. The health organization has to train people up to use them. And then that cycle, and we see this all the time, and then that cycle comes all the way back and we figure out, we asked for these things. We thought that would be important in terms of the capture of information. It could be easily displayed. It can be fit into the workflow. We didn't guess right. And now that has to change. We see that through the process, and then it has to come back. So as a community, ONC plays an important role in this. But so does everyone in the process, in that we have to tighten that circle up somehow. Quite honestly, the folks who conceived of FHIR, Graham, Lloyd, and the rest of them, this was some of the discussions that we had in the standards community from the very beginning, because we knew that the existing standards weren't supporting that circle of life a little as well as it needed to be. And so I think that's one of the reasons why FHIR, even though there's a lot about FHIR that I think many of us question. I'm a full believer in the idea that if we can get a RESTful API environment implemented in systems and then acknowledge the fact that these things change quickly, we need to design for the fact that they can change quickly, will allow us to manage some of the burden that the processes that we're describing will inevitably place on all of the people, clinicians, obviously, but also the implementers, the hospitals, the exchangers, the IHE folks, everyone. So I think that I don't want to sound kind of rah-rah and that we have to all band together to get it done. But I do think that There's, the clinical community should be listened to, and but also needs to take responsibility for making sure that the information that they need to take good care of the patient is actually there, and not feel like they're just the end of the stick. And that means standing up and demanding that the things that they need actually get done, getting people engaged in the process that Gay was referring to, in terms of those who are willing and able and interested enough to participate in the standards development process. They need to actually have someone who they can touch, who's engaged in that, so that they can tell them, look, this doesn't work for me, but I know it's important, and therefore I'm willing to accept that change if we can get it done right. So I think, there's a lot of stones on the ground. It's pretty easy to toss them, but we all live in that glass house.
Yeah, and I think one thing I'd like to add too is what I'm seeing going on with US Core now, which it reminds me very much of the life cycle process of CCDA. So, we've got the standard out there, US Core, which is, I love it because it reminds me of this whole process of, and life cycle of now folks are using things, they're using it, they're implementing it, and they sure are going to find errors or things they need that need to be changed. And to me, that's a great marker, because that means people are implementing, and that means we can make it better, and we can find out that, no, you can't leave this data element wide open, this bit. And when I'm talking about a data element in US Core, I'm talking about a little detail that's inside, as Brett was showing earlier. And, are there more things that we have to constrain down more specifically so that data element starts to flow? And that, this life cycle is just really interesting and shows that folks are starting to use it, which is really important.
I want to make one other point, and that is, again, I'll throw the EHR vendors a little bit under the bus here, in that, they have a tough job in trying to figure out how to implement this. But part of what's going on here is that many of the things that we define in terms of how we want things exchanged don't get all the way in. I know that's hard, but part of this is that there's some, one of the things that was asked in the question is that there's a lot of things that aren't encoded cleanly in healthcare records. And what are we going to do about that? So part of what the US CDI is doing, granted, I think there are some of us who feel it could be a little bit tighter in terms of its expectations with regards to alignment with standards. Almost all of the standards also say send text. Primarily we're interested in making sure that there are good ways for people to identify, this is a health concern, this is a medication, this is an allergy, even though there may be something that isn't encoded so the machine can't do something with it, but clinician can. And we always need to keep in mind that every time we implement these standards, we need to make sure that we make it easy for the clinicians to communicate the complete breadth of what they want to talk to another clinician about, or document so that they can remember it the next time they open the chart, but then also add the ability for the machine to do something valuable for them. And I think a lot of times, that's a hard burden. There's no question about that. And, no clinician wants to sit and type. And or very few of them do, at least. And so we have to figure out better ways of getting that data into these environments. I think we're working on that. That needs to be clearly a high priority. The fact is, we need to make sure that we allow for full breadth of information, unencoded, in addition to adding encoded information.
Thanks, Rob. That's a perfect segue for me to ask Mark to comment on, or to at least lead the comment on the ideal future state. We've talked about what's working, what's new, that there's going to be barriers, and obviously room for continuous improvement. I think we all, at least among the panelists, are on the same page about that. But I'd love to hear, Mark, from your perspective, because you, like Gay and Rob, pardon me, have looked at kind of the entire continuum, both of care, but also with respect to the data elements. So I'd love to hear you kind of paint a vision for the future.
Sure. So I tend to start with thinking about the broader use cases and even the broader ecosystem. I think the work that ONC did with the interoperability roadmap which came out back in 2015, was a great start for that, helping us think that it's not just the patients and the providers, but it's how that feeds into public health and population health. And in work that I'm now doing, touching FDA, CMS, other institutions, and the Gravity Project, we're now thinking outside that clinical diagram to non-clinical settings. We're thinking about how you bend the curve from healthcare to prevention. We're thinking about that not all care is actually around disease, like maternity care is a great use case for thinking about wellness. And that so anyway, I'm thinking about all of these things. So I'm thinking we wanted, and sort of the way I couched it in my remarks, we want to think about data elements that can be used in those variety of use cases and variety of settings. I think, again, social determinants is a great illustration of that. That's what the community services people need to get the referrals and interventions to provide better care that may in turn help the patient not come into the clinical setting. And because we have structured it, we are now able to bring that into the data aggregation and analysis that helps us do better with the learning health system. So I'm thinking broadly. I think we need to design with that broader ecosystem in mind, because these are all interconnected. They are if we don't design for it, it's still going to affect us. So that's my initial thought.
That's great. We have more time than I thought. So Gay, do you want to say anything? Because I think Rob kind of was able to talk about his vision a little bit in his last set of remarks. Is there anything specific to that question? We have a bunch of questions in the queue that I'm going to get to after I, give you a chance to talk about the ideal future state.
Well, I think I answered, but the only thing that I feel like, which I did mention in my slides, is that I think it's really important for ONC to look at providing more information within the once a data element is selected. And if there is no data element selected, like what happened with the errata when the goals and health concerns, if you click on that, there's nothing. So perhaps that's not ready to be in this version of data elements. And, or maybe the standards should be entitled something else, and that my other point about, you can't separate the vocabulary, can't separate out vocabulary from the vehicle that it's sent in. So the syntax and the semantics, they have to be married to make sense. Now, if there literally is no standard, but you can pretty much pick which vocabulary system you're going to use, maybe that's okay. So if there is no standard, but where it's going to be drawn from here, let's state that. But to have information, either no information, if there's no information, no standards, then maybe it shouldn't be on there. Other than that, if there are standards that are implemented, that should be asserted, allowing for the version advancement process.
Thank you so much. That's really, really helpful on that. So we've got a few minutes, and I think there's a few questions about specific to USCDI and maybe the common clinical data set that I'm going to ask Al to speak to. So Al, we teed those up for you. Do you want to take those?
Sure, thanks. There's two questions. One of them is about USCDI and CCDS, or Common Clinical Data Set, which the USCDI basically replaced. Talking about how those data sets can be construed as a burden on providers as far as data collection. And there's a second question about health IT requirements versus clinical documentation requirements. And I think those are two related, and I want to try and capture them at once. So the USCDI and the Common Clinical Data Set are defined data sets that basically comprise the core set of data, not to overuse the pun, but the core set of data required for a health IT system to be able to collect and to share and to use and to access. It doesn't mean that in every clinical setting, every single one of the data elements need to be collected. In many, many cases, that's not the case. However, they're it's not hard to imagine how that piece of data that's not necessarily collected in the clinical setting might be useful in the clinical setting, whether it's primary care, emergency medicine, surgery, population health. Those pieces of data might be great to have if you had them. And the expansion of USCDI from the Common Clinical Data Set addresses that. And that increased capability to have that information available in an electronic format, we see that as actually reducing the burden on physicians, because if you need the information and it's not there, you got to go get it. And what's the barriers to getting that information if it's not already in the Health IT? You got to go to fax, you got to make a phone call, you got to look up somebody else's portal, you got to do a lot of things, and that in and of itself is a burden. And so we feel like this increased capability of particular data elements could be a reduced burden as well. The Health IT capabilities or the Health IT requirements is not the same as clinical practice guidelines. It's not the same thing as, for quality care, you must capture medications and allergies and ask about advanced directives and things like that. It is simply the systems must be able to capture that, and then the clinical documentation requirements, depending on the particular practice setting, is that's a clinical practice issue, and it's not a Health IT issue. We had the same for the people on the call, and that probably is most of you that used to document on paper and maybe still do to some extent. What you're supposed to write down on a piece of paper is not the same thing as what the paper can contain. The paper obviously is a lot more flexible than an EHR, but there's things that you must for quality of care document. And that's the documentation burden, and that's guided by clinical practice guidelines. The USCDI is the Health IT capabilities requirements.
Awesome. Thanks, Al. A few other kind of themes I've noticed specific to, I think we've pretty well covered how to submit comments and submissions to our ONC process. But for those who might want to get more involved in the work at the standards level, for example, Gay, Rob, and Mark, all of you really are been quite extensively involved over the years with HL7 and some of the working groups. Is there anything you can say specific to kind of the evolution of implementation guides, or how those who might be interested in getting more involved or contributing, what might be, there's a lot of ways that I'm sure folks could go. So any thoughts there would be great. And I'll just let whoever wants to jump in, go ahead.
I'll start off, Ryan, with a quick thought. One of the things that the Gravity Project is looking at with social determinants of health, and I think it might apply outside of social determinants of health, is whether we need to do an implementation guide data element by data element, or whether there is some way to speed the process up and look at an implementation guide across a series of data elements, however defined. And perhaps Rob and Gay were suggesting that as well with the questionnaire, with sort of a common approach to questionnaires. But that's something that we're looking at right now. We haven't resolved it yet, but throw it out there.
Yeah, there is a FHIR capability, or it's called a library, and I've been thinking about that with respect to what you mentioned. Is there a way that we could, rather than have, and I think Rob mentioned this on the call the other day, rather than having the profiles to represent particular data elements buried inside an implementation guide, which is important because the implementation guide provides context, but could you actually go, and assume if there was a good repository where you could search for already existing profiles and say, oh, I want to use that. Because right now there really isn't. And then the tooling is kind of all over the place. But wouldn't it be great if, as an implementation guide developer, I could go in and if I create constraints around a data element and I save it, it tells me, hey, wait a minute, there's already a profile for that. or your profile is only, 1 degree different than this. And, is it important? Maybe it is. Maybe it isn't. But in terms of getting involved, I think the process for getting involved in HL7 is a bit of a tricky one, because you can hop in there as a clinician and you want to, all gung ho to do something, and then you're just like, wow, what are these people talking about? But I would encourage folks to do it, to jump in and just sit there and listen and take it in for a little while. And then you're there because you're the kind of person that is ultimately going to be interested, that is interested in that, but don't go away because you don't understand what folks are talking about. Just really dig in, and then we will be able to leverage your expertise because many of us were, actively involved in the clinical world, but maybe we're not now, and maybe some things have changed a little bit, and how we need your input on, I think, especially with respect to the clinician burden, thinking outside the box and thinking of how could this be better? What do you really want? If you were to, I'm going to offend anyone here, but if you were to throw out all the EHRs and all the replication of the sort of the paper world, what would your ideal be? And how could we, thinking that standards could be a prerequisite to functionality, and how could we make that happen? We need the clinical input. So don't be afraid.
If I may, so a couple of things. First, I think folks need to engage in places where they feel comfortable, and that, unless you want to go someplace and feel uncomfortable, go for it.
Well, you might feel uncomfortable for a little bit to start.
Yeah.
That's my point.
Yeah, no, I hear that, and certainly attending HL7 is if you're not involved in the standards community or implementing standards or those sorts of things, if you're just a practicing clinician, it's very daunting, and we've worked hard to try and figure out solutions for that, and I don't think we've figured it out yet. So with that in mind, I would suggest a couple of other things that if you're kind of on the side of, hey, I have to implement these things, I've got something that I'd like to actually, I'd like the system that I'm working with to get better. Work locally, and so find out, how the organization that you're engaged with is, who's there that's primarily responsible for bridging that gap between the actual practicing clinician and the implementers to the vendor that's providing the system, or wherever that next link is, and just kind of work your way up that direction. The other thing that I would suggest, I answered one question, a person who was saying that they were work at a community health center, and how do they give input? Well, other than actually going to the on-deck environment and just writing what you want to say, because ONC is interested in any input. Doesn't have to be as technically advanced as the sort of stuff you saw us present, because that's where we live. But put in what you want. But what I was also suggesting is that, like for other clinicians, there's organizations for the National Association for Community Health Centers is actively engaged in trying to kind of help bridge that gap between community health centers and the informatics world. We know some folks who are involved in that organization who are very savvy with regards to this entire sort of space. So I don't think, number one, you don't have to figure out all on your own. You need to focus on what's actually in play in your organization, who's already touching some of the standards or the implementation or the EHR. Work with those folks, work to make your system better, and then push to get whatever you could make better up working up the chain. I'll also say there was one question, and I'll just say, because we've used this phrase a lot. So what is an HL7 profile? What is an HL7 implementation guide? So these are phrases that are used to describe standards. So it's a type of document or type of actually web environment these days, now that we're doing FHIR, that describes how standards actually should be implemented by a system. They aren't functioning, EHRs. These are guides that implementers who build systems should follow in order to be able to make the systems that clinicians or non-clinicians involved in healthcare should actually be able to use, so that when they click a button or they type something in or they make a selection, it actually aligns with something that another health institution is also doing in another place, because we have that interoperability. So these guides support that. I'm pretty sure some of the documents that are in your briefcase will have links that you can click on so that you can actually go and see some of these things and either go, wow, or go, oh my God, that's crazy.
So just to add a little bit more on what a profile is, just to maybe focus it for the non-standard people. It's like you take a, say there's a profile called a condition profile, which is, a problem and, or a diagnosis. And then it breaks that down to all the little different data elements and bits and pieces that are needed to give you information about that thing. And that's really essentially what a profile is. And then there's another question that says, is there a resource or graphic that depicts the standards development, implementation, and adoption processes and timelines? That's a great question. Sometimes at HL7,
that's a perfect segue. That's a perfect segue for me to make a plug for all the resources on health.gov. I'm going to ask someone to put in the chat the USCDI fact sheet. We've got amazing graphics on enforcement discretion and everything related to the Cures Act final rule. I have a note that I believe if it's not already available, there is a graphic about USCDI and the SBAP process. So we have tons of great stuff on our website. And just a reminder that some of what we discussed today was look to the future and presentation of ideas of on the kind of philosophy of continuous improvement and us working as OMC with experts across the field. So we do have a very specific question before I officially close this out and we get cut off at 2:45 for another session. We have one more session of the day, so I will just plug that. Don't go away. There's some really great topics. One of which, if you were interested in some of what was discussed about EHR vendors and innovations in that space, I would definitely encourage you to participate in that session. But there's a question about from one of our colleagues. I'm just trying to find it here. Just give me a minute. About what we were covering about the gender identity data element, data class. I know that I'm mincing words that are important. Of course, now I can't find it. Hold please, everyone. Okay, so this, I think, again, I'm kind of trying to close this out with this because it speaks to how this is a changing, ever-evolving process. So in this case, our participant asked about what do you do in the case of something that will change, there's potential for something to change over time, and that change would fundamentally affect the clinical encounter, which is how this individual from Canada, thank you, who's also part of the Gender Harmony Project, asked the question. So how do we kind of grapple with those? I would consider that to be a challenge that I know a lot of people are working hard to manage through, and even through and during the current public health emergency. So I don't know who wants to take that or speak to that kind of issue, but I'll stop my commentating. I don't know, Rob, Gay, Mark, anybody?
Yeah, I can jump.
I'm looking for that question, and I'm not finding it.
It's under Ask Ryan.
Oh, it's under Ask Ryan.
So I'll jump in while you're looking for it, Rob.
Yeah, Mark, go ahead.
Ryan, what I would say is that this is a situation where we're looking at it from a clinical perspective, from the individual's perspective. This isn't a change. This is something they've been dealing with, and it's a part of them for a very long time. We're now taking a part of the system, and it is catching up with what's been in place for a long time. That kind of change is going to happen, and I think one of the solutions is to build from a multi-stakeholder perspective, so that when we talk, we have sort of like what the Gravity Project is doing. we bring the different perspectives into the room and talk about this so everybody is aware of this as we're trying to design universally for the good of the whole.
Yeah, I'll just mention, so Andrea's kind of a plant. And I think this went to Ask Ryan because she's specifically, I think, calling on the community to address a problem that we've not done a good job of addressing yet. And so there needs to be a commitment.
Okay, well, with that, thank you all for being here and joining us. Again, many thanks to the presenters. They did a lot of work to make this session a success. There is another resource for those of you who, outside of ONC, called ClinFhire, ClinFhire.com, for those clinicians who want to learn more about fire, who are not well-versed in coding. And I guess I just want to say thank you again so much for being here and for your participation. And we look forward to seeing you in the next session. Take care. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
There will now be a 30-minute break. Please join the working session starting at 3:15 p.m. Eastern.